The article by the author under the nickname Ms. Rimskaya describes the 4-day events of the October Revolution through the eyes of two teenage girls, which took place on the evening of November 7, 1917 and lasted for 4 days in Petrograd. Based on the topic of the 4-day pogrom, it was possible to find photographs of Petrograd from 1918 to 1921. Photos of Moscow and St. Petersburg without people exist, but it's hard to connect them to this time period. Some people even attribute them to the 19th century, to the time of civilization's restoration after the flood. Few photographs of the city exist, and those available have uncertain dates. Isn't it strange, considering such a phenomenal event as the Great October Revolution of 1917, and with technology, photos and films available, the city should have attracted a huge influx of journalists and photographers who wanted to capture the first post-revolutionary years of Petrograd. Strangely, there are actually very few such photos. In general, the widespread lack of well-being and simply hunger after the revolution is very surprising. The focus was on the Civil War, which ended in 1921, not in 1924. What war could they have been talking about at that time? With ruined infrastructure, food shortages, and widespread population purges, the post-revolutionary years were characterized not by general prosperity and the promised economic and social flourishing, but by unrelenting depression, cannibalism, the appearance of a huge number of homeless children, and a general decline in all social spheres. Even the United States, the heart of global capitalism. American President Hoover was forced to organize food supplies to the starving Soviets in order to prevent the population from dying of hunger. This isn't the first population purge we'll discuss. In photographs from the second half of the 19th century, St. Petersburg and Moscow are also shown without people, which many try hard to explain away. Officially, there is no mention anywhere of an empty Petrograd, despite the fact that there is enough publicly available information confirming the opposite. Officially, there is no mention of an empty city in open sources, enough to confirm it. In certain biographies of supposed residents of Petrograd after the October Revolution and up to 1921, in artistic works and their performers, in photographs of Petrograd from the revolutionary and post-revolutionary years, and with clearly inaccurate dates. It is obvious that the active and very diverse newspapers of Petrograd continued right up until the 1917 revolution. And then they abruptly switched to a style more similar to daily political news bulletins from the Bolshevik center. Their circulation clearly increases in 1922. The question is, if there was a general, even a very small, circulation of Petrograd newspapers in 1918 or 1919, then who were they printed for? If the October Revolution was spontaneous, then why was there such a blatant lack of police forces, and why is their mention in the official history limited only to the victims of arson and the destruction of police stations? Furthermore, there is evidence and even statements from Kerensky himself confirming that the coup was not spontaneous. There is confirmation that Kerensky knew about the start of the operation at least a week in advance, and that around 10 a.m. on November 7, he broke through the armed cordon and left Petrograd before the start of the nighttime coup. But what else could be done if in August this lover of liberal democracy cancelled the previously agreed and planned democratic elections to the Constituent Assembly, that is, the country's parliament? Since the March 8 revolution, he kept postponing them for various reasons. Here's another argument. In September, before the October coup, the provisional government ordered Petrograd and Moscow to be placed under military encirclement, allegedly until the war with Germany ended. The purpose of the military cordon was to surround these cities and monitor the entry and exit of citizens. The enforcement of this martial law and the pass system was assigned to military units, including the Petrograd garrison, who had already proven, and there is evidence of this in government reports, their unreliability towards the leadership of the provisional government. This was confirmed by their active participation in the October coup against the very same government that had trusted them. As they say, they let the fox guard the henhouse. In any case, according to the official history of the October Revolution and according to Kerensky, who left them almost on the morning of November 6, these controllers surrounded Petrograd with a powerful blockade ring. And this also indirectly confirms the words of the witness named Rimskaya, who said that it was almost impossible to leave Petrograd until the evening precisely because of these same rings of cordons that Kerensky had previously broken through. Petrograd is under a full military blockade. Before the start of the revolution, the official history doesn't mention it at all, nor its primary role in the main events of the coup. The author states that starting the military encirclement of Moscow was the final warning before the planned city-clearing operation. On these dates, September 10 and October 4 orders were signed by the provisional government to cordon off Moscow and Petrograd before the start of the October coup operation. On the modern calendar, these dates are September 23 and October 17, 1917. Without fully preparing to surround Moscow and Petrograd militarily, the operation could not have occurred. The military order for encirclement guaranteed that no reinforcements would come, and most importantly, that any reinforcements would no longer be able to save anyone. This is also how the official history interprets the events. It should be assumed that the name Great October Revolution was not chosen by accident. Why wasn't it called the Great November Revolution since the holiday was in November? Why confuse people with the dates? The answer most likely lies in the sacred meaning in the shortened abbreviation VOR. That is theft, robbery, which corresponded to the true meaning of what was happening, murder, robbery, and the mass export of valuables and assets. There is information that in the sacred scriptures there is an additional Bible of prophecies with a detailed scenario of what and when things should happen in the future. And this clearly aligns with the management according to the biblical project, everything that is supposed to happen in the near future. The information is passed down to all levels of management. The residents of the village Yukonevo in the Arkhangelsk region spoke about a certain pseudo-Bible which, about 100 years ago, talked about the future of modern history. The revelation was very important and shockingly accurate, but at some point it was lost, meaning it was removed from public access. At first, it seemed that it was about a certain interpretation of the Synodal Bible, but then it turned out that the texts had nothing to do with biblical stories. Though it was the Bible and a repository, the keepers took it very seriously. This also indicates that the biblical project exists, and the Bible is one of the sources revealing the planned scenario for the development of civilization. Because it's hard to believe in the randomness and spontaneity of all the supposedly predicted historical events with a sound mind. The fact that the Bible was created recently is easily proven by numerous facts about the flood of the 19th century, which negates the existence of biblical events and the history of Rome, as well as all other official history before the 19th century. However, this does not mean that the history of the 20th century is a chronology of events that actually happened. Even official history recorded the cleansing of Petrograd and other revolutionary Russian cities. But it was assumed that the liquidation of Petrograd was limited to taking control of the system of power, replacing officials and civil servants with whom any capital is filled. It turned out that the cleansing affected about 60% of Petrograd's population and was stretched out over quite a long period, after the start of the Red Terror and the assassination of Uritsky by Kanegeiser in August 1918, and it was further aggravated by the food shortage in the conditions of wartime devastation. But we couldn't even imagine that the operation to clear out the population began right on the day of the revolution and was carried out in a much shorter time frame, and the clearing out of the population was total. Alternative researchers are now puzzled, wondering what the photographs of central cities with no population mean. Is it early morning or a 2-hour camera exposure? The 19th century post-flood era. In reality, the reason people are absent from the cities is simple: they were wiped out. So, let's consider the version that famine and the Red Terror had absolutely nothing to do with Petrograd or Moscow of those years. That in 1917 the population of Petersburg was completely destroyed, and until 1921 the city stood without inhabitants. The following testimony is taken from blogger Sandra Rimskaya in the article Bloodless Revolution. You can have any opinion about Sandra Rimskaya's work, but it really seems like another piece of the puzzle confirming the overall picture from 100 years ago. Let's examine 3 eyewitness testimonies from that time. Many others can likely share similar testimonies. If you have a story on this topic, write in the comments or send information by email. Story of Valentina. One of the witnesses was named Valentina Nikolaevna. We lived together in the same communal apartment. I came back from somewhere, from visiting someone, and she was the only one at home. It was November 7th. I knew that everyone was celebrating November 7th, so I congratulated her. She replied, "Thank you, but no need. I was there and saw it all myself." I was surprised and asked, "You were there? You saw everything? That's so interesting. Tell me about it." She changed her expression, looked at me closely, and asked, "Do you really want to know this?" "Yes, I do," I replied. We went into a room, sat at the table, and she said, "All right, then listen." They lived in a 5-room apartment on Malaya Konyushenaya, neither poor nor rich, just average. Then the war began while Valia was in the gymnasium. One day, the father came home to find a note from the mother, who had run away with an officer. He loved her and took her leaving very hard. Then the men went to the front, and the women lost their breadwinners. They had to go to work. He called his 2 sisters from the village so they could run the household and take care of the children. That day, Valia was sitting at his classmate's house, and they were all doing Valia's homework together. She had to walk 2 blocks, and when she stepped outside, she heard a strange hum in the distance. There was something unsettling in the air. She got scared and went into a hotel. She was 14 years old, and the owner started telling her to go home. But then there was a noise outside. Some thugs were running back and forth, shouting. The owner of the hostel also ran outside, but soon came back. He was very angry and swearing terribly. Thugs, it's an abbreviation for City Hostel of the Proletariat, which stands for City Hostel of the Proletariat. The official history says hostels began in the 1920s, but this mentions 1917, so it's more complicated. The flophouse owner said a riot was raging outside. He hid Valia under junk, wrapped her in rags, and told her to stay quiet and unseen. The riot lasted 4 days and began to subside on the 5th. The flophouse owner came to her in the closet and ordered her to remove the rest of her good clothes and to put on some rags that he picked out from the same pile of junk, and he let her out through the back door. When she stepped outside, Valia realized what had happened. Red Army soldiers, bandits, thugs, and homeless people were rushing through the streets. Everyone was dressed in rags and tatters, and if she had been dressed differently, she would have been killed right away. The city was strewn with corpses, pools of blood, and a suffocating stench. The Bolsheviks rounded up the thugs and ordered them to throw the corpses into the Neva and the canals. So many bodies were found that they were still being recovered from the river over a year later. When Valia left her apartment and entered the stairwell, she saw all the apartment doors had been broken down. In their apartment, she found her dead father. He had gone out with an axe to defend himself from the rioters and was killed. One of her aunts was killed in the pantry, apparently trying to hide. The second was lying by the open window, having tried to call for help. Valia entered the children's room. Her younger brothers were lying dead next to the beds. They had tried to hide under the beds. There were bloody men's footprints all over the apartment. Everything they couldn't take, they smashed, broke, and ruined. The tapestries were slashed with bayonets. It was clear that all of this was done in a fit of rage. Drawers in desks and cabinets were opened and documents and valuables disappeared. Valia went to the neighbors and they had the same situation. Then she ran to her friend, but their family had also been killed. Many years later, a drunk thug in a tavern told her how the Bolsheviks rounded them up into teams and after the sweep made them comb through the whole city. They searched every apartment, attic, and basement for survivors or people hiding. Anyone they found, they killed immediately, finishing off the wounded too. After the war, Valentina Nikolaevna searched Leningrad for survivors or witnesses of the massacre, but found none. Newcomers had moved in everywhere and knew nothing about it. So she lived her whole life in Leningrad, and no one ever asked what had happened here. I was the first one to ask her that question. The story of a Jewish woman of moderates endured for a short time. That day, her mother's partner came and warned her to take the children and leave the city immediately. Will there be a pogrom tonight? She asked, a Jewish pogrom? Are they going to kill Jews? The man replied, no, it will be a Russian pogrom, but they will kill everyone, so leave immediately. Drop everything and run, save the children. Her mother had already prepared for such an event. A house in the village was bought under someone else's name. Documents were prepared listing her as a peasant, as well as documents for her children. She quickly packed the essentials and valuables, put the children on a cart, and led it out of the city. As they moved, they counted more than 5 checkpoints. By 4 o'clock, all of Petrograd was surrounded by Red Army troops in 5 to 7 rings. And although she said she was a peasant woman who had come to find a husband, she had to repeat this at every checkpoint. She was only allowed through after she gave the Red Army soldiers money, gold, or jewelry. But for them, the revolution did not end there. After the pogrom, Red Army soldiers searched nearby villages for city dwellers and killed anyone they suspected was from the city. The peasant woman they stayed with for the night took the mother to the cellar and hid them. They returned to the city in 1929. Their house had been nationalized, and they had to start from scratch. They had no acquaintances. She lived her whole life under someone else's documents. She later married a commissar. She adjusted well but stayed silent her entire life, never revealing she was from Petrograd. Her husband, children, and grandchildren didn't know about this. I don't know how she realized she could tell me about this, and I listened to her confession for several hours. Apparently, the woman needed to get it off her chest, but until now she hadn't been able to. Our conversation remained a secret from her relatives and grandchildren, with whom I maintained friendly relations. The first thing I heard when I arrived in Leningrad was a warning that you should never, under any circumstances, tell anyone that you lived in Petrograd before. 1916. Moreover, those who had lived there before that were not registered in Leningrad anymore. And in general, it was dangerous to mention it. Everyone thinks that since the book 10 Days That Shook the World by John Reed was written by a communist and at the invitation of the Bolsheviks, it is considered a reliable account of the actual events. Few know nothing of the original chronicle's remains. In the following years, possessing materials taken from the original of this book threatened exile to 10 years in labor camps. The Bolsheviks carefully guarded the secret of the revolution in Petrograd. Enormous efforts were made to create a fake history of those years. Thousands of books and films about the passionate Bolsheviks and the bloodless revolution in Petrograd were produced to cover up the truth about what really happened from October 25 to 29, 1917, and what took place in the period leading up to its settlement in 1921. Valentina Nikolaevna, who was in Petrograd all this time, said that for several years the city stood dead. It was a city without people. Although sometimes you could still encounter a few individuals who managed to survive in these conditions. Immediately after the pogrom, the dead Petrograd was looted by everyone, and shootouts occurred between groups of looters, and at times there were real battles. Because Petrograd's population declined, Moscow became the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics' capital, though it had never been Russia's capital before. And for a long time afterward, there was a joke that Moscow was actually the capital of the Moscow region, and that's true. If you look at older maps, Moscow is the capital of Muscovy, Muscovite Tartary, and European Tartary. Petrograd was always Russia's capital. Here's another story from Fyodor, one of those who was in Petrograd during the revolution, then escaped and later returned. When he and his family arrived in Petrograd in 1921, Petrograd was dead. There were hardly any people in it yet. His grandfather was summoned by Cheka acquaintances and ended up on Gorokovaya Street. He saw Chekists burning a pile of documents from murdered Petrograd residents in the courtyard. Since no one marked them as deceased, all of them were legally considered alive. And the criminals took advantage of this to escape retribution for their banditry during the revolution. They took the clean documents of murdered Petrograd residents, and it was very difficult to find these bandits later. The documents show these were different people. Now, when the liberal intelligentsia talks about how, under Stalin, show trials were fabricated against professors and the creative elite of Petrograd and Moscow, they deliberately leave out the fact that all these so-called professors were actually criminals who had changed their identities and took advantage of this fortunate opportunity for them, but they remained criminals, and that's why they were later prosecuted. And now we know why the Red Petrograd professors of the academy didn't graduate. Everyone knew this. Many bandits grabbed complete sets of documents belonging to murdered professors, princes, counts, and other well-known people, including those who were involved in the arts and were famous in Europe and Russia. The scandal was started by the White Guard émigré in Europe. When these snowdrops crawled out in Petrograd, the Bolsheviks wanted to show that the scientific and other elites had taken their side, and as soon as these red professors appeared in Petrograd and Moscow, a scandal of such magnitude broke out in Europe that Stalin initiated a trial against the red professors of Petrograd. And then purges began in Petrograd. People came from Moscow and all over Russia on behalf of the investigative committee who either recognized these bandits by face or knew the murdered professors. They walked around Leningrad, attended events, and caught these werewolves. These Red Petrograd professors and other elites involved in the revolution were hunted down by the People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs in Petrograd like rabid dogs. My acquaintance's grandfather, who shared this, also took someone else's documents. There was something to hide with those merits before the revolution. He proved more cunning, selecting the documents of a murdered Petrograd worker's family from the pile, with the same family composition as his own, and he disappeared, erasing his crimes. No one will ever look for some ordinary worker. Back then, houses in Petrograd stood empty, with broken windows, and almost no one lived in them. And he also used that very term to describe Petrograd in 1921, a dead city, a city without people. He chose a large communal apartment not far from the Cheka so he could walk to work. That way, people living together in a communal apartment could fend off raiders, which was not uncommon in those years. Communal apartments did not emerge because bourgeois apartments were crowded. Contrary to what movies and historians suggest, there were actually plenty of empty apartments. The Petrograd pogrom impacted all of Russia. In the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the 3 non-working days around November 7th were, for some, a restful reward for the righteous. For others, these 3 days were national mourning for Petrograd's murdered people. In Leningrad, people tried to call themselves Petrograders, Petersburgers and newcomers, but no one called themselves Leningraders. They also avoided the name Leningrad. In Leningrad, people called it the city or the capital. Once Petersburg was the only city on earth. That's where its name comes from, the eternal city. And in people's memory it is still remembered that it was always the capital of the world. What did the title of John Reed's book, 10 Days That Shook the World, mean? For 4 days, the Red Army carried out a massacre and sweep of Petrograd, and then these hordes of Red Army soldiers poured from Petrograd into Moscow. For 6 more days in Moscow, fierce street battles raged between locals and the Bolsheviks. Of course, for modern communists, liberals and even Democrats, such Russian truth about who the Bolsheviks were and the very bloody way they not only carried out a coup in Russia, but also changed the paradigm of the entire civilization's development is inconvenient. During the census in the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, it turned out that in Leningrad, about 250,000 so-called native Leningraders stated during the census that their families had lived in Petrograd even before 1916. In reality, all of these were the grandchildren and great-grandchildren of those bandits who no longer knew that at that time the entire population of Petrograd had been killed. This was the elite of Leningrad, who represented real power and were part of the entire Soviet elite. A whole army of werewolves in Leningrad alone. How many of them actually turned out to be all over the occupied Russia? This information has not been preserved in any official documents or archives, and now, when people trace their ancestry all the way back to the Middle Ages, who among them knows how many such losses and total substitutions happened just in the 20th century alone, not to mention the 19th, 18th, and so on. These masses of substituted descendants, so to speak, surfaced as the liberal democratic electorate during the preparation for the next coup d'état during the economic reforms of Yeltsin and Gaidar. As a result, Russia experienced a new coup between 1987 and 1991 when, according to the plan of the new elite, 20% of the population was supposed to die of hunger during the economic reforms, and this was not hidden. Those affected by perestroika and democratization recall the turbulent 1990s as a time of banditry, destruction, and millions of deaths every year. The descendants of Bolsheviks and bandits see the 1990s as sacred. The last vote on amendments to the constitution clearly showed that such descendants who do not want to change the status quo established 100 years ago make up 20% of those who voted. And if you take into account those who expressed their refusal by boycotting, there might be even more of them. Perhaps today is exactly the time for the truth about the events of 100 years ago to be revealed. On the channel Another History, evidence was shown about why the population of Peter was wiped out. During those years, technologies, materials and factories of the pre-flood civilization were taken out of Peter, and all these technologies were sent to Europe and the United States. Because even back then it was decided that the Anglo-Saxons would become the successors and overseers of the biblical project. After that, all scientific concepts and discoveries started to be attributed to the names of supposed Western pioneers. We've known this for a long time, and figures like Tesla were written off. These technologies were patented to control future implementation of what would or wouldn't be allowed. It was with the October Revolution, with the abbreviation, as we remember, VOR, that the removal of fuel-free technologies began from the territory of Russia: atmospheric electricity, radiation heating, and much more. Why did the world's reformatting start with Russia? The answer is simple: because the center of a unified European civilization was located on the territory of modern Russia, and it was eliminated during the years of the 1917 revolution. Most likely, there was a similar center in North America which was destroyed a little earlier. So if Petersburg was the capital of the world, it becomes obvious why it was necessary to eliminate the world elite who were located in this world capital at that time using the hands of the Bolsheviks and other forces, led by the Anglo-Saxons. It was in 1917 that the final change of planetary elites took place, resulting in the ones we have today.